Welcome to the third program of On the Move. Today we will talk about far-right politics in Europe and its impact on European migration policies with journalist Daniel Trilling. We have a lot to cover today. We will look at a wide range of issues that Daniel has worked on, such as the far-right Golden Dawn's trial in Greece, how far-right groups and discourses impact migration policies in Europe in the light of the recent attacks we saw in France and Austria, criminalization of solidarity with refugees in the Mediterranean, and Turkey's place in this whole, basically, picture. First, I'd like to introduce my guest. Welcome, Daniel. Thank you. I want to introduce him. Daniel is a British journalist, editor, and author. He was the editor of New Humanist magazine between 2013 and 19. He writes about migration, human rights, nationalism, and far right in Europe. He is the author of two books titled Lights in the Distance, Exile and Refugee at the Borders of Europe, and Bloody Nasty People, The Rise of Britain's Far Right. He mainly writes in The Guardian and the London Review of Books. Thanks for joining me today. How is London in the first days of the lockdown?
Thanks a lot. Well, I haven't actually been outside today, so far, no difference.
And we won't be talking about, of course, these today, but especially with the lockdown in Greece that starts this week, the most majority, as you have reflected in your own recent writings, is how the lockdowns are going to affect the refugee and the migrant communities through the winter. I guess that will be probably something we'll talk about soon again, unfortunately. So let's start. My first question will be on the Golden Dawn and the Golden Dawn trial in Greece. The Golden Dawn's trial in Greece is of almost 470 court sessions since it started in 2015 after the murder of anti-fascist rapper Pavlos Fyssas, aka Killa P, in 2013 by a member of Golden Dawn. The crimes of Golden Dawn obviously are many, and especially their violent attacks on migrants and refugee communities is quite well known. Athens court, after 5 years, just a month ago, sentenced the party leaders up to 13 years in prison, and by a landmark verdict, declared Golden Dawn as a criminal organization. The Golden Dawn trial is claimed to be one of the most important political trials in Greece's modern history. Can you please tell us what Golden Dawn is and how it evolved since its foundation at least about 4 decades ago?
Sure. So Golden Dawn is a far-right neo-Nazi organization that, as you say, was formed about 40 years ago. It was founded by people who were supporters of the right-wing military dictatorship that ruled Greece in the late 1960s and into the 1970s. But from the outset, the ideology of the people that founded the group was neo-Nazi. So it drew directly from the ideas of the German Nazi Party and of Adolf Hitler. For most of its existence in the 80s and 90s, it was a small underground organization that was involved in extreme right-wing activity in Greece, would very often carry out attacks on left-wing opponents, but at quite a small scale. But it really began to grow in popularity after the global financial crash of 2008. And in particular, the Eurozone crisis that hit Greece, very badly in the years afterwards. And Golden Dawn began to pick up wider support. And then in 2012, had several of its candidates elected to the Greek parliament, which was, it was a very shocking event at the time. Obviously, in Europe, more widely, there had already been the growth of far right and right-wing populist politics, but this was the first time that a party with such extreme politics had such sudden success in an election.
This was 2012, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So, in 2012.
The 2012 elections were when Greece's political polarization really kind of came to the surface. So what you had after the financial crash was a series of governments that were trying to impose austerity measures on the Greek population that were being insisted on by Greece's lenders, you know, the EU, International Monetary Fund, these organizations that had bailed out the Greek economy were insisting on these huge and very devastating cuts to Greek public spending that were having a very bad knock-on effect on the lives of ordinary working class and middle class Greek people. And one of the results of that was that the kind of old political system fractured and voters started moving to the left and to the right. So you had not only the growth in support for Golden Dawn on the right, but you had the rise of this coalition of radical left parties known as Syriza. And in fact, actually, Syriza were the bigger beneficiary of this discontent, but Golden Dawn also managed to co-opt a great deal of that. But as I was saying, this was sort of similar to trends that have happened elsewhere in European politics. But what was so different and so shocking about Golden Dawn was the extremity of their ideas, the fact that the party's internal core ideology was taken directly from Nazi Germany, and also that it wasn't just a party that stood candidates in elections. It was a, you know, quite deliberately organized paramilitary style movement. So again, copying the way that the German Nazi party was organized, it had an electoral side and it had a street fighting side, and it had members who were trained in combat, sometimes had weapons, who were organized into paramilitary style squads who were carrying out violence. And this is what the trial ultimately proved on
can you provide a bit more concrete examples of the actions they took, especially after they came into power?
Yes. So, I mean, for its whole existence, Golden Dawn was associated with violent assaults on, you know, left-wing activists, political opponents, and also migrant communities. From about 2008 onwards, when Golden Dawn began to grow and sort of put its election-winning strategy into practice, the number of violent assaults, particularly on certain migrant communities in Greek cities, really accelerated. So there are particular neighborhoods of Athens, the Greek capital, that, you know, in the last 10 to 20 years have become multi-ethnic, multicultural neighborhoods with immigrant communities growing among people from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from countries in different bits of Africa and so on. And Golden Dawn quite systematically targeted some of these communities in order to drive people out of certain neighborhoods. So this is something that I have done my own reporting on, and has also been, you know, heavily documented in the trial and elsewhere, that there was a pattern of attacks taking place on particular migrant communities in Athens and elsewhere, where there would be a very similar modus operandi. So, for example, the Afghan community in Athens around 2010, people had all of these stories of how at nighttime, Afghans walking through certain neighborhoods by themselves or in small groups would be attacked by groups of men all dressed in black, all behaving in a coordinated way, attacking them with bricks or broken bottles, in a way that was like more than what you might call a normal sort of racist attack. It wasn't just a spontaneous thing. These were planned and targeted assaults, and that accompanied Golden Dawn throughout its existence. And even after it had its MPs, its candidates elected to Parliament, was a crucial element of its strategy. And what began as attacks on migrant communities eventually expanded to increasing numbers of Greek citizens as well. And as you mentioned earlier, the murder of the rapper, the anti-fascist rapper Pavlos Fissas, which was in late 2013. So this was when Golden Dawn already had 17 or 18 MPs in Parliament, was part of this strategy of street violence. But it was the last straw in a way. So that tipped the balance and forced the Greek state into acting against Golden Dawn, when in the past it had been seemingly very reluctant to do so.
Yeah, I mean, it's also very interesting in my perspective with the history of Germany in Greece. how these organizations have found strongholds is quite kind of confusing in a sense, very difficult to understand. And we also know that Golden Dawn has infiltrated into many significant positions in Greece, especially the police force, over a very long time. And we still see this. And even now, when you tell me the Men in Black, this is almost exactly the same narrative now we hear of the pushbacks at the Evros and the Aegean Sea, that the refugees are reporting that they've been pushed back by Men in Black in arms, which we assume to be the Frontex or the Coast Guards. But so it's also interesting to see how that narrative also now gets represented in actual migration practices run by the authorities in Greece. So in that sense, this ties to my next question, as I said, that Golden Dawn has a very stronghold in, or I don't know if it's a stronghold, but it has a presence in the police forces, with a lot of signs and initials. These, especially on social media, we see them circulating, people, pointing out on the police forces. And when New Democracy became the ruling power in 2019, after 2012 and 2015 being the third party, Golden Dawn, in the parliament, in the 2019 elections, they couldn't get a seat in the parliament. But many people argue that their anti-migrant, anti-refugee, to a certain extent, far-right migration discourses through New Democracy have actually form the government. Basically, they are now in the government itself, although they are not in the government themselves. So in a sense, my question would be, of course, the trial is a major victory. Pavlov's mother, who was a big force throughout the trials, at the end had that iconic scene where she screamed, "You did it, my son," and then the lawyer of the Golden Dawn victims said, "We won." But I want to ask, what is the success here? Do you think that there will be a significant impact of this trial in the future of Greek society, Greek politics? And even could it have any implications for the far-right organizations in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question. And I think there's a couple of things that get mixed up together when we talk about these issues, that it's quite useful to separate out a bit. So I'll try and do that now as briefly as I can. But to begin with Golden Dawn, I mean, you mentioned Golden Dawn's anti-migrant ideology, which is certainly, they do have an anti-migrant ideology. That's a big part of their political makeup. But what they stood for goes well beyond that. I mean, Golden Dawn have a Nazi ideology. They're a fascist organization that essentially was aiming to reshape Greek society into a fascist state, an authoritarian state. And for them, they saw violence as a legitimate, organized violence as a legitimate way to achieve those ends. And as we saw with Nazi ideology in the 20th century, the kind of ultimate goal of that is to purify society and remove internal and external enemies. And for Golden Dawn, anti-migrant, xenophobic, racist ideas were a means to an end. They weren't sort of the core of that ideology. But obviously within Greek society, European society, places all over the world, sort of anti-migrant and xenophobic ideas circulate among a much broader section of political currents.
Yeah. And
if we're thinking about what was achieved with the Golden Dawn trial, what the victory was that it marked the fact that Golden Dawn as an organization had been completely smashed and prevented from operating. So one of the big problems that Greece had leading up to 2013, when the state finally moved in and arrested the leadership of Golden Dawn, was that Golden Dawn were able to start laying out parts of their plan and orchestrate this violence with seeming impunity from the Greek state. So there are some quite complex reasons as to why that would happen in Greece specifically. Obviously, one thing is it's particularly bizarre to see it happening in a country that was occupied by Nazi Germany during the Second World War and suffered so badly. But you know, Greek society in the 20th century was fractured. You know, the Second World War ended, but immediately after that, a civil war between left and right, you know, broke out, and there are kind of deep divisions in Greek society linked to that. But also, as I mentioned before, the dictatorship of the late 60s, early 70s was, you know, that was a right-wing or far-right military dictatorship, and that in itself involved the use of, you know, small extremist paramilitary groups to do the job of the state where the state couldn't be seen to be doing that. After the fall of the dictatorship, the question of how much these networks still operated was really unresolved. There was no kind of full reform of the Greek criminal justice system and the state to completely remove right-wing networks from contact with the state, and in more recent times, it still remained unclear as to how much crossover there is between those two things. And as you mentioned, there were you know, repeated reports that Golden Dawn had been recruiting among the police force, for example, or that it had sympathizers within the Greek police, and quite a lot of evidence about that was aired at the trial. There were wiretap transcripts of officials within the Greek police force apparently discussing plans, you know, for example, the policing of demonstrations where left-wing activists were demonstrating with members of Golden Dawn and so on. And a lot of that remains quite unclear. But I mean, I think it's a good, if we think about sort of the idea of anti-fascism as opposed to the idea of anti-racism, these are two, for me, two really important political principles, and they're very often linked, but they point in slightly different directions. And I think thinking about anti-fascism, a really important part of that I think sometimes gets a bit glossed over when things are discussed is it's as much about preventing organizations from materially being able to operate as it is about defeating their political ideas. And I think the thing that you can say is undoubtedly a big success when it comes to Golden Dawn is that the trial, which was linked to a huge campaign by anti-fascist activists as well. It wasn't simply the Greek state coming in and sorting things out. The trial probably wouldn't have been a success if it wasn't for the work of anti-fascist activists, lawyers, legal observers, people who dug through the evidence and found things that the state prosecutors missed.
And journalists who have been investigative journalists has worked on this too, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And investigative journalists as well. It was like it was a social movement that helped bring this to pass, really. And the result of that is that Golden Dawn is an organization which can gather funds, recruit people, train them in violent activity, indoctrinate them into neo-Nazi ideology, has been prevented from operating. It doesn't mean that people with those ideas have completely disappeared. And it doesn't mean that wider anti-migrant, racist, xenophobic, or even right-wing populist ideas have been defeated. But I think it's really important to recognize that these two things are kind of separate but linked. So that deals with kind of the first part of it. Now, coming on to the second part of your question, it means that, you know, in Greece, as in so many other countries, not just in Europe, you know, Turkey, the US, India, so on and so on, right-wing populist ideology is a big thing, you know, but it's mainly not neo-Nazi fascist organizations that are the bearers of this. It tends to be either sort of newly emerged populist parties or mainstream right-wing parties that have absorbed this kind of right-wing populism and made it a part of their existing platform. So where I come from, the UK, the latter is the case. You know, it's the Conservative Party who are in power, but since the Brexit referendum and all the various different upheavals, what they've done is they've taken on a large element of the right-wing populist agenda and just brought that into their existing political platform. And, It's slightly different in Greece, but I think you could make the argument that that's also roughly where the governing New Democracy Party is at as well. You know, they won the general election last year, running on various things. You know, they were in some respects, they were presenting themselves as sort of socially liberal, business-friendly, very pro-European, and so on, while at the same time, they had a very hard line on migration, on asylum seekers, border security, and so on. So perhaps a better way of interpreting that is less that it's Golden Dawn's ideas that are sort of thriving and living on. It's the same anti-migrant ideas that Golden Dawn picked up and used are still widespread and are there for other people to pick up and use as well. And so what we've seen in the last year in Greece since the New Democracy government came to power is that there's been this toughening of border policies in the Aegean and at the Evros on the border with Turkey. And that involves violence. It's a different kind of violence to what, say, a party like Golden Dawn might be doing, but it involves using the state in order to violently expel people back across borders. Often people who are very vulnerable, either because of the methods they're using to travel or because of their own personal histories and situations and so on. And as numerous human rights observers and journalists and other kinds of activists have pointed out, a lot of what's been happening has been has directly contravened sort of international agreements on protecting the right to asylum or on protecting people's human rights as they cross borders and so on and so on.
So maybe from Greece, we can move on to a bit larger part of looking at the European society, especially after the recent attacks in Paris, Nice, and Vienna. We see again and again, how anti-Muslim rhetorics are ignited, associated with migration, which risks criminalizing a whole body of migrants and refugees, especially after the fact that it was made public that the recent attacks in France, the attackers were both migrants, one from a young man from a young Chechen man, and another one who have just recently arrived in France through Italy from Tunisia. And I know it is possible to say that these voices, far right or conservative, anti-Muslim, and these are not new, and it has been quite around, especially after the 2015 summer. I remember in 2016, after the New Year's event, especially in Northern Europe, the headlines were like constantly about the migrants, and migrants, specifically young men, as in quote, not only as terrorists, but also as suspects of gender-based violence against white European women. And again, when we look at the Migration Pact, the relationship of the Visa Guard for, Czechia, Poland, Slovakia, and Holland, and other far-right groups like AfD in Germany openly opposed any responsibility sharing of any sort. And, the Migration Pact is already anything but pro-refugees anyways. So in 2018, in one of your pieces, I think in The Guardian, you wrote, in quote, "The real challenge posed by the far right is its success at spreading anti-Muslim and xenophobic attitudes in society at large." Close quote. Most of my colleagues in Germany keep telling me, like, never mind these, neo-Nazis and far-right people. They are just a small minority. We overall in German society welcome refugees. But from what I look at the migration policies, it reflects completely the otherwise. So my question would be here, like at a time when the far-right figures are treated like international spectacles, in my opinion, and just this week we saw in the US elections, an openly QAnon supporter, the conspiracy theory group, has now a seat in the House. So can you tell us, like, how the far-right movements in Europe are mobilizing? And of course, I mean, it's hard to generalize as Europe, but maybe you can, give specific examples only from particular countries or regions. And how does their influence actually goes in changing not only the society, but also the big P, basically?
Yeah, well, I think the broader picture in Europe is that in general, the movements that have grown the most in the last, let's say, 10 years on the right have been what they've been doing what's normally called right-wing populism. So they, it can vary from country to country. So this is very broadly speaking, but right-wing populist movements are quite broad groupings of various different trends on the right. Sometimes it can involve people with kind of extreme right-wing fascist ideas and so on, but it might range all the way through to kind of more moderate conservatives who are pulled into it, or even some people that were, formerly on the left. But what I think links all of the different right-wing populist movements together is that what they try and do is they try to build a movement against what they see as the establishment and its dominant values, which broadly characterized, as they would see it, would be that the sort of democratic will of the people is being undermined by an unaccountable globalist elite whose values are far removed from ordinary people of any one particular country, who they disdain things like national identity. They don't have their people's best interests at heart. They're too ready to favor the interests of dangerous outsiders, whether they are immigrants, asylum seekers, foreign citizens who commit crimes, and so on, rather than put the interests of their own people first. So the sort of claim that these various right-wing populist movements are making is that we're the ones that really represent the people against this elite, and we're here to re-establish the will of the people, and also to reimpose the will and identity of the nation. So the idea of the nation comes into this very, very much as well. And they've had in some respects a startling degree of success in that. Right-wing populism is now kind of firmly implanted on the political landscape in many different countries. You mentioned the US. I think we're talking today while the ultimate result of the election isn't known, but I think one thing that you can say from how close the result has been is that it shows that Trump and what he stood for is not a passing thing, that this is something that is now kind of embedded in US politics and isn't linked only to him as an individual, but is like, these trends are likely to continue even after he's departed from the political scene, whenever that might be. But having said that, I think it's important to recognize that, first of all, that's never, I don't think anywhere in the world that political trend represents a kind of majority. It hasn't achieved sort of full dominance in the politics of any one country. Normally these movements at best have managed to build up support among a large minority of a population of a particular country. But what it shows is just how much a political movement can do to set the wider agenda with support of that kind. And I think the pattern in Europe has been, over the last decade, that faced with the rise of right-wing populist movements, politicians of the centre, who for the most part have still maintained power. Most governments are still governments of the centre. So they've got, they're still in the decision-making position. What they've done, seeing the growth of right-wing populism, is tried to accommodate it in one way or another. So tried to draw support away from the populists by doing things that they will think will keep voters happy and keep them voting for them. And on the issue of migration, particularly around the borders of Europe, that has been the driving dynamic. So obviously migration, particularly, what the technical term is irregular migration, so people crossing borders without permission from the states that they're wanting to cross into, is always a source of fears about sort of security and identity that are exploited by various strands of the right, mainly. But this has been a driving dynamic in European politics, particularly since the refugee crisis of 2015, where, I think it's important always to say that it's been a driving dynamic, but it's had a big counterweight to it as well. I mean, I would characterize Europe's response to the crisis of 2015 as conflicted. I don't think it's one thing or another. There was an effort, I'm talking about European society at large and not just the politicians here. There was a huge outpouring of humanitarian concern and, a desire among large numbers of people, first of all, to help people in distress, but also to organize, to organize in a way that would help people and improve the system. And there was a backlash. There were people who gave voice to these kind of xenophobic, racist fears about outsiders entering Europe, either about the security threat that they might propose or the fact that they had a supposedly alien culture or religion or ethnicity and so on and so on. And these are kind of two competing strands in politics. But I think if you look at the direction of travel of the European centre politically, since the refugee crisis of 2015, one of the overwhelming trends, I think, is this effort to crack down on borders based on the idea that if we don't do this, the populists will get in and it will be much worse if they do it. And I think an illustrative example of this is on the situation for search and rescue in the Mediterranean. So, the kind of backstory is Europe, for many, many years, didn't really take its obligation to protect life at sea seriously enough, in my view. After the Arab uprisings of 2011, which led to greater numbers of people trying to cross the Mediterranean to reach Europe, Europe's response to that was very inconsistent, veering between making attempts to save lives at some point and effectively just abandoning its duties at others. And that dynamic, that very dysfunctional dynamic, fed into the refugee crisis of 2015. There were efforts by some countries to prioritize humanitarian rescue, Italy being the biggest example. But after 2015, there was a sense, I think the consensus was that the priority was to reduce the level of migration across the Mediterranean, and that search and rescue was an inconvenient obstacle to doing that. And as Europe drew down its state-operated rescue operations, you had all of these volunteers coming in to fill the gap. So people who chartered their own ships and went out into the seas near Libya or into the Aegean Sea, and actively looked for people in distress and tried to rescue them. And that ranged from large international NGOs like Médecins Sans Frontières or Save the Children to smaller groups of volunteers who came from a more overtly political activist background, I would say. And
right here, I could ask actually this, you actually even moved on to my next question, so I want to make the connection. So in a sense, within these anti-migration policies growing in Europe, you have also worked very extensively, as you now comment, on the search and rescue operations and the narratives of the refugees, as well as the narratives of the volunteers at sea. So maybe you can continue also by giving a bit examples of how these policies that you are discussing at the Mediterranean particularly had affected the lives of people who are in need or the people who are supporting them, basically.
Yeah. So to just sort of finish what I was saying before, the situation a couple of years after the refugee crisis was that increasingly it was volunteer groups and NGOs and charities who were stepping in to carry out rescues at sea, but also on land. That was part of a much wider pattern, that essentially the state had been absent or was deliberately absent because the priority was to control migration, to reduce the numbers. So you had these networks of volunteers, activists, civil society stepping in to do jobs that should really, at least in their view, have been done by the state. But then when that became viewed as inconvenient by governments as well, those volunteers were then cracked down on. So in terms of the impact that it had on people in need or people stepping in to help, I suppose that, in the most basic terms, it meant that it became harder to protect life and protect people's safety. It became harder for people to access their rights, access due process, or to move around freely to find places where they could get what they needed. You know, there was a period in 2015-16 where it became very easy for people seeking asylum to move around the European Union, and now it's not again. And that creates, you know, European politicians might say, well, yes, that's the way we want the system to work. But objectively speaking, it causes great problems for people who are seeking asylum, because they get stuck in countries that either don't have the capacity or the will to accommodate them safely, to deal with their asylum claims, to ensure that they have rights to justice, and so on and so on. And they're physically prevented from moving and seeking support elsewhere. At sea, it's meant that it's become more dangerous. So there's some very good research that's been done recently on migrant boat journeys from Libya towards Italy, where, you know, from the point of view of the Italian government, which turned very heavily against migration in about 2016-17, and the EU generally, you know, the policies have been a success. The number of people departing Libya on unsafe boats has really decreased. And I think they would argue that that's also a humanitarian success, because if you have fewer people traveling, there are fewer people overall who get shipwrecked and who die. But actually, the research that's been shown recently is that the crackdown on search and rescue has meant that, you know, in proportional terms, those journeys are deadlier than they were 4 or 5 years ago. You know, there may be fewer people traveling, but because there's the lack of a dedicated search and rescue operation, you are more likely to sink or drown if you get on one of those boats. And at the same time, that research has basically revealed that the narrative that justified that crackdown, which was that rescue provides a so-called pull factor on migration, that it encourages rescuing people, only encourages more people to take the journey, isn't really borne out in reality. So, you know, at least with Libya, the research that's been done has shown that when it comes to the NGO rescue ships, it makes no difference whether they're at sea or not as to whether people are setting sail from Libya. You know, because if you understand anything about the smuggling trade and how things operate in Libya, it's controlled by smugglers, and they have an interest in putting people out to sea regardless of what happens of them next. Yeah. And the people that they're sending out to sea have got an interest in leaving Libya. They're extremely motivated to do so because of the situation there. So the role that rescue plays is very different to how it's portrayed, I think, by a lot of policymakers in Europe. And then another aspect of the impact that's also really important is that you've seen the growth of what we could call the criminalization of solidarity. So this is going back to this idea that you know, during the refugee crisis, you saw lots of ordinary people, citizens, migrants, you know, a whole range of people stepping in and forming networks to do jobs that really the state could have been doing. So that could be rescuing people at sea. It could be organizing food distribution for people on the move, or people stuck in, you know, sort of unsafe camps in different bits of Europe, or other bits of their journeys to Europe. It could be people organizing with migrants to campaign for more rights, or to access the rights that they should already have under law, to help people through the asylum process. Although actually very often it came down to much more basic things than that, such as providing food and shelter, warm clothes, and so on and so on. And this is something that's happened not just in the Mediterranean, but in pretty much every country in Europe over the last few years. You know, on Greece's islands in the Aegean, at the French-Italian border, at the border between France and Britain, across the English Channel, and so on. And
besides even not only just the government's authorities criminalizing, but these people are also socially criminalized as well. They are seen as foreign agents, smugglers. I mean, at least in the Aegean Islands that I've seen in Lesbos, they were not, you know, they were targeted. They have been targeted in similar ways as well, by very, I don't know how you would name them. I won't say far right groups, but like very conservative, the people who are fed up in their terms with the migration crisis, the so-called crisis, basically.
Well, yeah, I mean, exactly. And I think that this isn't just limited to Greece in that respect. That's a wider dynamic. And I think, again, it's these sort of two conflicting currents in politics at play. You know, these same people who you know are criminalized, or you're saying like kind of socially criminalized for doing this, are also people who've been widely celebrated, often sometimes by the same institutions that then put obstacles in their way. You know, particularly at EU level, there's a sort of big celebration of all the humanitarian work that's been done and the huge volunteer effort. Or, I mean, the island of Lesbos in the Aegean was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, wasn't it? Because of the response.
Yeah. They actually got the 2016 Nansen Award. Ethilatsudi and the Lesbos Solidarity received the award in 2016.
Yeah, but at the same time, the very same people or places become the object of this huge hostility. And I think the dynamic that I see at play there is that you have anti-migrant politics is a thing that exists. It's a kind of endemic thing in our societies. And when situations reach, either because the situation has reached a real kind of flashpoint, there's, the refugee crisis was effectively the breakdown of Europe's border system. It was a system that prioritized security and deterrence over protection of life and protection of refugee rights and other rights as well. And it collapsed in 2015 effectively. And that could have been a point for a wider discussion about, well, look, maybe it collapsed because it doesn't recognize the reality of this situation, which is that displacement happens. People will try to move to where they feel they can get a safe place, but also build a life. I think that's the bit that is often not recognized. It's not just about surviving from one day to the next. It's people thinking about, where can I live where I'll retain agency and control over my own life and feel like I've got a future? And, some of those people, even if they originate in parts of the world very far away from Europe, will think of Europe as the place where they can find all of that. It's a minority of the people who are displaced around the world today, but it happens. And I think rather than accept that reality and think, start a conversation about, well, how can we shape our policies to fit that reality? The reaction, the sort of overriding reaction from Europe in the last 5 years has been, well, how can we restore the system that we had prior to 2015? How can we put back the defenses? And I think when you have that consensus develop, among politicians of the centre, who are then kind of put under extra pressure by right-wing, radical, far-right movements, populist movements, who try and kind of always inflate the sense of crisis and shock and kind of turn it into a zero-sum situation. The thing that then follows on from that is the targeting of people who stand in the way, whether they are migrants, people on the move, or people who are intervening socially in order to support them. And I think, what you described happening on the Aegean Islands is a kind of it's a microcosm of that. I'm sure on those islands, the population will have always had people who tended to be very supportive of migrants' rights and had anti-racist politics, and people who are quite hostile to it, or people who stood in the middle and thought, well, I want to be supported, but I see all of this chaos and these problems happening and someone needs to come and sort it out, and so on and so on. And then, as the overall direction of policy changed, as the attitudes sort of politically, the prevailing winds politically shifted, it was the hostility that started to win out. Another really good example of that comes from some of the reporting that I've done is with...
A little quickly because we're running out of time, and we have one more small question to talk as well.
Well, I was just going to add the example of NGO rescues in the sea between Libya and Italy, where again, their role was widely celebrated. They received millions and millions of euros in donations from Italian citizens over several years. But from 2016 onwards, they began to be seen as inconvenient by policymakers, but they were also really under attack from the far right, from right-wing populists like Matteo Salvini, the Italian right-wing populist leader. And you saw within the space of about 6 months, a completely wild claim that originated on the right-wing extreme fringe, which was that the NGO rescue boats were collaborating with smugglers in Libya, just came to take over Italian political discourse. And it effectively became the attitude of the state that that's actually, maybe the state's version of it was, oh, well, they're doing it unwittingly. You know, they don't intend to be helping them, but they are. But it became the consensus. And what happened then was that seizures of ships and prosecutions followed. So I think that's the dynamic that has played out in all of these different situations or different places in Europe over the last few years as the wider politics have shifted. Yeah.
Maybe lastly, for a couple minutes at most, we also, like, just the end, how do you see from a European perspective, especially after the March 2020, the role of Turkey, because Turkey is a major actor in the migration management of Europe, but how do you see its role now in the aftermath of March, from a European perspective?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously we've talked almost entirely about Europe so far, and there are good reasons for doing so, but it's also the fact that, this happens within a wider set of geopolitical relations. Other countries also have responsibilities towards refugees, they're capable of making the lives of migrants better or worse, and so on and so on. And I think Turkey's role here has been quite complex. Obviously, it's been a major country of transit for people fleeing several different conflicts, people trying to reach Europe, but it's also hosted much larger numbers of refugees, per capita itself. And at times the Turkish government has been very open and welcoming, so to speak, to certain groups of refugees. And at other times it's also denied their rights, or it's also put in place its own harsh border policies to try and stop people moving. And I think we were talking about kind of like the changing political dynamics, and the two big things that have changed this year is, first of all, the coronavirus pandemic, which has provided a sort of extra excuse for states to close their borders, or stop rescue ships from docking, or withdraw from refugee resettlement programs, if at least only temporarily. But the other big dynamic has been the kind of worsening relations between Turkey and parts of Europe. So, it's become, the border between the EU and Turkey has become the site of geopolitical conflict, which has added an extra layer to the migration issue. And I think, obviously, just before the pandemic arrived, there was a new border crisis where large numbers of people looking to cross into Greece arrived at the Evros border, the land border with Turkey. And I think obviously that some of the dynamic was a repeat of what was happening in 2015, but I think it's also just worth noting that was something that I think the Turkish government actively encouraged, as a kind of, it deliberately engineered a situation where there would be thousands of people trapped at that border as a way to place diplomatic pressure on Europe, because at the time what it wanted was for NATO to support its intervention in northern Syria. And I have to say, I thought that was an extremely cynical use of migrants, essentially using them as a political bargaining chip. But unfortunately, that's what happens if you have a larger bloc, the EU, that regards migrants as an unwanted quantity, something they would just rather get rid of at any price. And the sort of longer term historical dynamic to that is that the EU for many years has tried to use countries in its neighborhood, as they call it, countries outside the EU, as border cops on the EU's behalf. So for years, the EU and EU states have pursued agreements with Turkey, Libya, Ukraine, Morocco, all of these countries around the edges of the EU, basically saying, please stop migrants from coming to European territory, and we'll give you various things in return, financial aid, easier travel for your citizens. Well, the desire to keep out migrants and to play into that kind of xenophobic politics that underpins it means that it gives those countries this kind of leverage, potentially, over Europe. But unfortunately, that leaves the lives of migrants in the middle as just being treated as if they don't matter, as if they can be passed around as pawns on a chessboard. And that, I think, for me, is the thing that it's always really important to highlight and to draw attention back to when faced with these wider political conflicts around it.
Thank you. On that note, I'll have to end. I really appreciate you joining this discussion. Thank you very much for your input, and hopefully soon we'll again see each other. Thank you very much. Take care. Be
Thanks
safe. Healthy. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks everyone for watching us. In 2 weeks, we'll be back with the On the Move program soon. Thanks.